My dad used to go do the shopping. He went with horse and buggy, and most of the people did the same thing in the neighborhood until the 1920s, when somebody in the neighborhood got a car.
As far back as I can remember, they drove cars, but a lot of the places had board sidewalks.
There was no electricity till 1910. So I didn't see that. That was before my time. In 1910, when they wanted to get electricity, the power company said they would put poles down. All the farms were involved. They'd run poles down the road, but you had to put your own poles on your own property and do your own wiring to get your electricity to your barn.
There was a lot of rooming and boarding houses in Issaquah. The sewer didn't come into Issaquah until about 1940. Before that, I don't know, because they didn't have septic tanks, so I'm not quite sure what they did.
We had a phone in the old farmhouse down there, and everybody did. There was 9 houses on one party line. Now, can you imagine today having 9 families on one party line? Oh my God, it was terrible. You could dial in Issaquah. You didn't dial, you had your old ring phone. You could ring it, but if you wanted to get anybody out of Issaquah, then you had to call the operator in Issaquah and she'd connect you up. And so she knew everything there was in town. Everybody else knew everything that was going on in town because people had listened to your conversation, you know. Oh, it was just maddening.
It was a lot of the same old buildings, and there was, you know, a couple of grocery stores, lots of taverns. Women were allowed in the taverns. They could even sit at the bar, which wasn't the case when they started serving whiskey in the restaurants and bars. Women then could not sit at the bar, which doesn't make much sense, but that was one of their laws. Children could go into the bars then. If my folks were going to go down and meet somebody, and I was an only child, and there wasn't any money for babysitters, so you know, just sit there, be quiet.
They used to have dances in Issaquah, and then they had dances down at the old barn. And lots of times when my dad would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to come out to the barn, there'd be Model Ts and old buggies parked out in the barnyard out there because all the couples were up in the haymow. So I figure, I thought about that a lot, and I figure that old barn has got a lot to do with the development of Issaquah. Well, they'd come to the dances, and even before, and we used to catch them down there. At the bottom of these silos, there was the pipes that stuck out to catch the corn juice because of the pressure in the silo from all the corn, and the juice used to run out these pipes, and guys used to take a jug and stuff and put under it and get this juice and then mix it with something. I don't know if you want to call it moonshine or corn liquor or what, but my dad said drinking that straight till your hat would fly off.
There was still basically the same front street, except, you know, we didn't have a light or anything like that. And the city limits only went as far as the creek. So the creek was kind of like the boundary.
When we first saw Issaquah, this was in the late 40s, to me, it was not exactly what I had in mind about where I wanted to settle. I think when we first came out, there were no employees, full-time employees, other than the city clerk.
The year was 1954. Again, 1954 was the big year. The industries that were thriving were relatively limited. The logging days and the coal mining days of Issaquah had long since passed. Issaquah had a population of about 1,250 people. It was very quiet. It was very quaint. It was a real typical small town, and it was a typical small town America.
There was so little here that I can recall, and it took a number of years for Issaquah to become what it is today.
Issaquah was really enjoyable. The environment was great because it was small. It was 1966. And the population, as listed on the welcome sign, was 5,000.
From 1971 to 1973, I never knew what a residential burglary looked like. because there wasn't any. No one did any serious crimes at all. And then as Bellevue started getting bigger and Issaquah started getting a little bigger, not much, then we started having more crime. But it was never, it was always nice crime.
Homes were spread out, and it was still fairly rural in a sense, except for the groups of people that lived in town, some who had been here for many years.
One of the other major things that occurred was the Metro sewer transmission lines that came through. Metro built a transmission line from its pumping station on the south end of Lake Sammamish to Issaquah that made it so that the city's sewer treatment plant was no longer viable, was no longer used, and so all the sewage could be pumped from the south end of Lake Sammamish all the way to Alki Point, to West Point. So when that sewer capability came, then Issaquah really began to grow.
Jail never changed. In fact, the whole police department never changed from 71 to 82 when I left. It's located the same spot it is now. Only thing is, it was a one-story building that was connected, and the jail was connected to it. It only had 3 cells in it. It was much different than it is now. Right now, it's very professional. We had people that would come to us from prison and get in trouble somehow or whatever, and they'd end up in our jail. Well, they would use their crafts that they learned in prison. In fact, one of them made up beds for us, you know, real prison beds.
It was different than a lot of small towns. Many small towns, you have to live there 20, 30, 40 years before you're really accepted. Here in Issaquah, we were accepted right away because we were not only, we think, pretty good people, but we were providing a service and something that the town desperately needed. As far as fire department and city services, there really weren't many rules and regulations in those days that we had. We put in all of the water lines with the fire hydrants, but under today's code, there would not have been enough water coming out of those fire hydrants to hardly put out a fire. And we would have relied on the pumper trucks that came up full with the water to be used to extinguish a fire.
We didn't have rules and regulations then. We just did what we darn well wanted to do. One program that we had was called Vacation House Checks. And it was like pulling teeth to have the cops go to these houses where people would go on vacation, and they would call up and say, hey, I'm going to be gone all of the month of August. So, and here's my address, and here's the emergency contact if you find something odd or whatever else. Like August was, you could have 30, 40 houses on the list. So I got to thinking, you know, we've got some senior citizens that keep coming in and they want to be buddy-buddy and they want to talk and all this other stuff. I'm going to put them to work. Well, they loved it. And they did a great job. In fact, they went on Johnny Carson's show on national TV because someone let out the word that we had these different senior citizens that were getting in the marked police cars, and I would just let them talk on the radio. I mean, who would care?
The parks director was Carrie Anderson, just out of school, and so eager and such a delightful young man. And he and Marvin hit it off over the years, and they worked together in every way they could.
Carrie Anderson, who used to be the parks director here. I believe that Carrie might have been the very first parks director of the city of Issaquah. And Carrie built single-handedly a park system that was excellent for a small town like Issaquah. Tibbetts Manor, Tibbetts Valley Parks, the community center, all sorts of things that we have today was a result of Carrie Anderson working together with Leon Koss and the rest of us in the community to get this stuff done. But Carrie was one of these that he would get something done even if the rules said that he couldn't. He would work on weekends or do whatever it took to see to it that the projects got finished, and he did it on a shoestring. They didn't have any money. for city parks. And I think Cary today would be very proud of his park system. It's expanded, it's quite large, especially with Issaquah Highlands and Talus. It's something to be very proud of, and Cary and Leon were instrumental in that. Leon and Cary came to the city about the same time. Cary retired very early. I would say that Cary retired in his 50s or 40s maybe. And today he would be in his 60s. Leon, I think, is in his late 50s. And so from a history standpoint, they're not that old as far as part of the town is concerned. They're relatively new because Issaquah is quite elderly. But they've probably had more of an effect quickly on a community than many other people that I could name. Leon Koss is another person who's been instrumental in this community, but Leon has been here for, I believe, 30 years. And he is the city administrator and has been the city administrator for 30 years. I know that he has the record for the longest longevity, if there is such a longest longevity, of any city administrator in the state of Washington. And Leon has been responsible for many of the really good things that have happened here. Without Leon's support, it would never have happened. Lee Hepler had the Ford dealership, and then Jerry Malone bought it from Lee Hepler. And I remember them like it was yesterday, as well as Mike Shane, he and his wife had the Shamrock restaurant.